This is the DLR Cast, the essential podcast for fans of Diamond David Lee Roth. All right, welcome to episode number 3 of the DLR Cast, the essential podcast by and for fans of the mighty David Lee Roth. I'm Steve Roth, no relation that I know of, and with me is my friend and fellow DLR fan, Darren Paltrowitz. Darren, how are you doing?
I could not be any better because we're about to talk about one of the greatest singers ever in one of the most awkward periods of his life and career. And that just makes me very joyous. Yourself, Steve?
I am well. And for those, I'm real good. So for those who are new to the podcast, why are we doing this podcast? Well, because we're huge fans. And despite being a press magnet for 40 years or so, we both think that too little attention has been paid to Diamond Dave's musical contributions, particularly his solo work. Although tonight we are going to talk about 1995-96 era Van Halen with David Lee Roth, or David Lee Roth momentarily for a second getting back into Van Halen.
Mm-hmm. We sure are.
So let's set the scene here. 95, Dave does Vegas and bounces out of that. It was too soon, too early, I guess. Vegas was a different sort of place. You know, this is after what was his worst selling solo album at the time, Your Filthy Little Mouth, which I like in a lot of different ways. 94, that record comes out, lays a big egg, sadly. And then in 95, he hits Vegas, and that didn't do too well. And in 96, with Van Halen about to do a greatest hits album, which became Best of Volume 1, Dave catches wind about this and puts a call into Eddie. I just love the idea that they hadn't talked in 10 years. And I'm just going to call up Eddie and say, hey, what's going on with this?
Right.
From what I know. And so Roth contacts Eddie Van Halen, want to find out details. They get in touch. And at this point in time, there was only going to be one new track on this album, and that is the song Humans Being with Sammy Hagar, and that was already recorded for this. Mind you, this is the summer of 96. Humans Being is already recorded, and Eddie asks Roth if they'd record 2 new songs.
That's the common narrative, but if I can sidebar a little bit, I know we're a little sidebar. I was trying to explain this period of Van Halen to my wife earlier today, and I realized in talking too much, which I do, about the whole thing, how weird the whole thing is. So correct me if I'm wrong. When David Lee Roth left Van Halen, it's one of those things of, I didn't quit, they fired me. And then he says he quit, we didn't fire him, correct?
Right. Yeah, it was it was. I mean, I guess the short story was the Van Halens were getting ready for a bit of a period of inactivity after the massive 1984 album and tour. And Dave never wanted to sit around, says, I'm going to mess around with some cover tunes, have some fun, and then jump back into Van Halen. And so he does Crazy from the Heat, right? The EP with Just a Gigolo and California Girls. And then I guess from what I've read, they tried writing some songs together, but by that point, it was just oil and water with him and Eddie, and God knows, for so many other reasons and so many things. And Dave starts, I guess at the time Van Halen said, well, Dave left because he wanted to be a movie star. Well, I think Dave kind of left because they didn't want to really do anything at that time, from what I gather.
Yeah, so we got one of those, I didn't quit, they fired me. No, that's not what happened on that side. Sammy Hagar, didn't basically the same exact thing happen where he wanted to do a solo record because they want to kick back, and they went, okay, you quit. And he goes, I didn't quit. Didn't that happen there too?
To a degree. I think at that time, before Best of Volume 1 came out, Sammy was going to have a baby. And so he needed to take some time off. And the Van Halens, Alex had tremendous neck problems. Eddie's hobbling around with, hip problems. And this is after the Balance World Tour. And, so you're looking at a period of inactivity. And from what I've read up on this, Sammy said, listen, I'm going to be a dad. I need to be home for a bit. You guys need to recover physically. And you know what I gather? I gather that you can't tell Eddie and Alex anything. I mean, if it's not there, you know what I mean? It's like, hey, let's take some time off. I'm going to do this movie. No, you can't do anything else but be with us. You know, there's something. I'll tell you, there's some real inner workings with the Van Halens that nobody sees or so many people don't know of, because it is such a quiet camp. But when you read different things over time, it's just, there is a weird thing with those two brothers. I mean, I think they're just, incredible control freaks, but it seems to be often it's our way or the highway, and very often their way doesn't really go anywhere sometimes. Hence the fact that, I mean, the band has been virtually inactive for the better part of, with the exception of Dave coming back, and been virtually inactive for 20 plus years.
Okay, so we've now covered point 2 of point number 4. Point number 3 is, not everybody realizes that Mitch Malloy was singing in the band, or at least trying to sing in the band, in 95 or 96.
Yes,
you're familiar with that, I assume?
Yes, I am, because so either Sammy left or was fired or was pushed, but you're exactly right. I'm not exactly sure the timeline, but I did hear about that, and it was never announced. He was never officially made the singer, and I don't know how that kind of dovetails with this time frame with.
I got you covered here, Steve.
All right, hit me with it, because the timeline is wacky.
Of course it is. And sometime in 96, Mitch Malloy was, I don't know if writing or just rehearsing with them, but there was some kind of a hiatus, like, oh, we'll regroup in a little bit. And then he saw Dave and them have the reunion on the VMAs. And then he saw, wait, what? And then he went, guys, I'm done. I can't do this. All everyone's going to talk about is Dave. So
wow,
that's point 3 or 4 right there. And then point 4 of the whole thing is, depending on who you ask, Dave thought he was back in Van Halen, and they were going, no, he's back for 2 songs in Van Halen. Do you notice a pattern here of
yes,
to paraphrase Rat, a lack of communication?
Yes, and so that brings up a couple things when it comes to the recording of these songs in particular. So here it is. Humans Being with Sammy Hagar's in the can. This Greatest Hits album, Best of Volume 1, is supposed to come out later in the year. Roth finds out about it, calls Eddie, says, let's do 2 new songs. Let's do 2 other songs, which became, and we'll talk about these songs in depth in a bit, the 2 songs with Dave, Can't Get This Stuff No More, and Me Wise Magic. Mm-hmm. So talk about lack of communication. Eddie says, yes, come back. It's only going to be 2 songs. That's it. Guess what? He reportedly, apparently, and I've looked this a couple different ways, he never tells Alex and Michael.
I've read that too. Probably the same place as you did, but yeah.
Can you imagine that? Here it is, July of 1996, and here comes Dave sauntering into the studio. I'm back. I mean, come on. I mean, it's kind of a big deal. Hey, by the way, I forgot to tell you, the singer that drove all of us crazy, who left, is going to come back for 2 songs. I mean, my God, that blows me away.
Yeah. And then there's all sorts of lore around these songs about who wrote what, if they're leftovers. I think that they're both leftovers aside from the vocals. What do you think?
Yeah, I wonder how much of them were done. I mean, it's pretty well known just how much material Eddie has stockpiled at 5150, and they've always pulled of it from so many different records. And from what I gather for these 2 songs, Eddie wrote a song that for Roth that, quote, he didn't particularly care for, and Roth, I guess, went back with Eddie and looked at a bunch of other songs that were kind of already in stages, already had written, and stuff that he had possibly written or co-written or already worked with the guy who ended up producing the new songs on the 3 new songs on this best of, Glenn Ballard, who is a pop producer, basically. If I remember, he did it last Morissette, right? And
he did that, and he wrote Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson.
Right. So that's kind of interesting, the fact that Glenn Ballard's producing this, right? So as far as the structure of those songs, the bones of it, I mean, I haven't been able to figure out, like, I had heard that Can't Get This Stuff No More. Parts of it was out there before. Me Wise Matt. It's hard to tell where some of this stuff all came from, but apparently for Me Wise Magic in particular, Ballard had already written some lyrics for it, and Dave talks about this in his book Crazy from the Heat as well. And at one point, they want Ballard and I guess Eddie, or at least Ballard, wanted the band and Dave to write with, of all people, Desmond Child. So, which Dave said, and he brings this up in the book as well. No thanks. That's just not even. That's a non-starter. So it's interesting because the songwriters credited for this song are Eddie Van Halen, Michael Anthony, David Lee Roth, and Alex Van Halen. Split 4 ways. They always did with the songwriting up until that point. So Glenn Ballard is not one of the writers credited on any of these on either of those 2 songs.
Nor is Sammy Hagar. And there's rumors. This is a Wikipedia thing, and it had to have come from somewhere else. That Can't Get This Stuff No More was originally called Backdoor Shuffle, and it was part of the sessions for Balance. And I've worked with a lot of songwriters in different capacities, whether it's management kind of stuff or PR, clearing stuff. And there's an old adage of change a word, get a third. Have you ever heard that before?
I have, yes.
And for those who don't, it's a really nerdy insider term, but it's kind of like people are all in the room together writing a song. And if you don't flex your creative muscle at all, then you don't get any of the publishing. So people are like, how about instead of saying cannot, you say can't? They go, oh, that's a good idea. And when it's coming down to the splits of the song, it's, well, he was in the room and he contributed to the lyrics. So yeah, let's give him a share of the song. So I would just have to assume Sammy co-wrote or participated, just like with the album A Different Kind of Truth. Some of those were leftovers, yet Michael Anthony's name is not on the credits. So has Van Halen been shifty on some of the songwriting credits?
Yeah, that's what I wonder too. And at least for the first 6 albums, I mean, well, I think for most of the albums, I mean, they always split things 4 ways. They're kind of famous about that. Yeah. But I remember a couple months ago reading Noel Monk's book. Sometime around in '84, they totally redid the publishing, and I can't remember all the details. But Michael Anthony later basically got fucked out of all his publishing, even though it was originally split 4 ways, and that was Eddie's idea, from what I know of, from way back when. Hey, we're a band, all for one, one for all. We're splitting this 4 ways. I mean, years ago, I used to think that songwriting was just a real, when I was younger, was just a real holistic thing. It's like, hey, the bass player didn't come up with the bass line. He should be cut in on it. The drummer didn't, the bass player came up with the bass line. Did he not co-write the song? I mean, you could parse this so many different ways, but what ends up who knows what happens before the song actually gets published? There could be, what's that phrase? You don't want to see the sausage being made. I mean,
yeah, that's where I was going with that. And one of the bands I've worked with has, I think they still do this, a very interesting way of splitting their publishing, where they kind of divvied up 50-50 in terms of 50% of it goes to the person or people who actually wrote the song. And then the other 50% is an equal share of everybody who was part of, the band or part of the production. So that way, if one dude wrote it, he gets all of that 50%. And then in that one, the other half, he gets 12.5. So he gets 62.5. At least you're giving a taste to the other people in the band. And it definitely causes resentment in so many bands when one person's making the lion's share of the money. System of a Down is one band where that happened with. It turns out that the guitar player writes almost everything in that band, and they were all going, why does he make all the money? Now, granted, I would rather have 10% of System of a Down's money than 99% of most bands' money. They made a lot of money. But you see things, Poison, that's a band that supposedly split everything across the board equally. And you listen to Talk Dirty to Me and you go, there's no way Bobby Dahl wrote one word or one lick of that song. But I think there is that mentality of, we were in the trenches together, we starved together. And therefore, we should all have a taste because we're in this together, and we'll all be doing things to earn our keep.
Right. Yeah, I get it. I get it. I mean, Van Halen in particular. I mean, I remember way back when thinking it was super cool that they split everything like that, right? But as we later learned, it wasn't always to be, to be that way, I guess. So, I mean, the background this, you're right about Can't Get This Stuff No More. That was a leftover from the Balance sessions, but I'm not exactly sure about Me Wise Magic. So when it comes to the music, think back a bit when you first heard these, and think now as to what was and is your opinion. Let's start with Can't Get This Stuff No More.
If we're going back to 96, 97, I thought that both songs were absolute garbage. I was bored by them because I loved 1978 Van Halen and 1984 Van Halen, and I loved Humans Being for some reason, and I still kind of do.
Same here.
But I just thought these songs were garbage, and I only really warmed up to them in the past few years. I know that's a very sweeping general thing, but what about you?
Well, I'll tell you, and I think back to, and Dave mentioned this in his book too, that when it came to record these songs, he hadn't sung in 6 months since the Vegas gig, right? And he wanted to warm up and said, hey, we should rehearse and we should pull out a lot of the old Van Halen songs. And the band was like, nope, we're doing these songs and that's it. It's my way or the highway. And so when I first heard Can't Get This Stuff No More and hearing those verses where he's in the low register like that, I'm like, shit. This does not bode well for his voice, right? And the harmonies are there in the background. That's Michael Anthony, of course. And it picks up. But so Can't Get This Stuff No More. I wanted to like it. I suppose I can give it a good C. And this is following Humans Being, which I loved and still love. That song just drives. That's one of my favorite tracks with Sammy and Van Halen. It's a top 10 track for me. And there's a lot of stuff that they did that I actually do really have liked. But then Me Wise Magic. I absolutely love that song. I love the hook. It's just, I think it's such a triumphant song. I mean, I love the lyrics. It's just, the harmonies are great. It's upbeat. It's a pop song. I dig it. I really do. It's the song's got a couple different elements to it. I mean, it starts off kind of dark and then it's just uplifting. And it turned to me I legitimately love that song. And in preparing for this, I found myself, I had listened to it again for the first time in at least 5 or 6 years. And I was like, damn, this sounds really good cranking in the car with the sunroof open on a great June day. So
100% yes. It is a schizophrenic song, I think you could say, because the opening of the song has nothing to do with the chorus or the pre-chorus. It is all over the place, and Dave is doing the high register and the low register, which is not something he did very often.
Right. I mean, when I look ahead a little bit, certainly neither song, maybe Me Wise Magic to a degree, but neither song sounds as good as anything that ended up being on the Reunion album in 2007, A Different Kind of Truth, which I absolutely love that album. Mm-hmm. And but also, I don't know if Glenn Ballard was necessarily. I mean, it sounds like Van Halen, don't get me wrong. And if you look a little bit further ahead, these songs, the 3 new songs with Humans Being and then the 2 with Dave, well, they certainly sound better and are better than anything that ended up on Van Halen 3, which I said in the last episode, I don't own. I have listened to it before a couple times, and I went back and listened to it this week again a couple times, and it is all over the place, and it's just not a good sounding record either. And I love Extreme. I love Gary Cherone, and I remember thinking at the time, this should be great. It's just not. I defy anybody who would say that's my that's my favorite Van Halen record, because they got to be lying.
I have this permanent memory, unfortunately. Do you remember that MTV show called Fanatic? It's totally cool if you don't.
I do not.
Okay, MTV had this show late 90s, maybe it spilled over into the early 2000s, where they would find the biggest fan of a particular band or artist. And I don't know how they were able to pull this off, but they somehow would just whisk the person away like, hey, man, we got to get you into a car right now. You got to look at this. Look here. and like, look at what, and then all of a sudden their favorite artist ever that they're obsessed with just randomly appears, and that they sit them down, they talk to them. And it was like kind of cool that MTV was doing it, but then you think about it and you realize, oh no, they're just hawking a new album. That's what they're doing. So you could probably find this on YouTube, and I have not watched this in 20 years. There was an episode where the kid's favorite band was Van Halen, and they showed him Van Halen 3. How do I put this? This happened during Van Halen 3. So they whisked the kid away to backstage, and he's talking with the band, and he's hanging with the band. And Eddie Van Halen says this one thing about the song on the album that's a piano ballad that I think he sang lead on.
Right.
And he says something like, if one person hears this album and is grabbed by it, then mission accomplished. And then the guy goes, well, you grabbed me. And then it goes, and then it was like a heartwarming thing. I think that maybe he wasn't trying to write hits, and that could have been to the detriment of it being a great album.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, there's some of those songs just don't go anywhere. There's not a hook. I mean, it's just, yeah. Perhaps the decline started before that. I mean, some people might argue that with the Balance record, which is kind of somewhat forgettable compared to like OU 812 and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge before that. But getting back to these songs, Humans Being, might as well talk about that as well. That was successful. That was a #1 rock hit. So there's two singles that came off of this, and Me Wise Magic. Also, Humans Being was a #1 mainstream rock hit, and then Me Wise Magic went straight to #1 as well. So it's certainly, and I remember at the time hearing it on the radio a lot and being psyched and thinking maybe Dave is coming back. And they announced that they're going to be on the MTV Music Awards in September, and this Best Of record is coming October right after that, the same year in '96. And this has got to be setting up for a great reunion, right? Well, as we know, that was not the case. It was very short term.
I actually don't remember hearing either of the new songs with Dave on the radio or any buzz about the VMAs. I just remember watching the show as a fan of award shows back then, and they announced Van Halen, and they're like, ladies and gentlemen, Van Halen, like for the first time in 10 years, Van Halen. And then Dave's on, and you're like, what? Like, it totally was a surprise to me. I didn't hear any rumors whatsoever that Dave was coming back or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there was no internet then, but I remember, I don't know where I would have heard it. Maybe I read it somewhere, or it could have been just my imagination, just people talking. Well, there's 2 new songs, and we know Sammy's out of the band, so Dave's got to be back in, and he's gonna, he shows up on the VMAs. So that's got to be a reunion, right? Well, that reunion lasted about as long as it took to record those songs. And even back then, and Dave says this in the book, was, there was a lot of arguments that it's just these 2 songs. Let's play it by ear. Let's see where it goes. And Dave certainly had some cringeworthy moments, and being on stage, you could just tell they looked uncomfortable with each other. And from what I know from the Heat and some of the other accounts of it, I mean, they almost came to blows after this thing. I mean, they didn't like Dave's hamming around. Dave wanted to talk about a reunion. Let's all get it back together. Dave is kind of like, sometimes I think, like a very, very pushy salesperson. And it's like, listen, I'm not buying the magazines for the Publishers Clearinghouse. You say I can still I can possibly win without buying the magazines, right? Let's just leave it at this. Let's just do the 2 songs, and that's it. We'll play it by ear. Settle down. But you give Dave an inch and he'll want to take a fucking mile, and God bless him for it. That's great. But clearly the whole thing imploded within hours of them stepping on the stage at the VMAs.
Do you remember the MTV News interview with Alex and Eddie Van Halen about this whole ordeal?
Yes. It made me cry almost.
Cry with laughter when, is it Alex who threatens Dave where he says, and the next time I see him, he better be wearing a cup.
That was Eddie, actually, according to the book. Yes. And even Dave questions it in the book. He's like, what is with these guys and want to kick me in the balls all the time? What the hell? So
I don't understand, first of all, we know that Dave is a martial artist.
Yes.
Who is never out of shape ever. Ever. He didn't have all the knee and hip surgeries that you guys did. So you punch within your weight class because Dave will wreck you.
Probably.
There's enough rage there. Like, he might be smiling, but he is tough. Second thing is, what kind of a man threatens another man that way? That is the least tough thing. That's even less tough than Vince Neil challenging Axl Rose to a fight on the roof of Tower Records or whatever that was.
Yes. Oh my God. See, this is why I am still, and we'll talk about this in a later episode, but I am still sometimes dumbfounded that the 2007 reunion was actually ever came about, and a whole tour, and followed by an album not long after that. I mean, to this day, I'm still amazed at that. I mean, they certainly looked happy on stage most of the time. I mean, no one imploded on. I mean, I remember I'm getting off on a sidebar here, but I saw the first reunion, the reunion tour in 2007. They were amazing, and we talked about this before. I mean, Dave sounded great, didn't mess around with any lyrics, and Wolfgang can play his ass off. He's no slouch there. He definitely can hold a candle to Michael Anthony's vocals, but backup vocals, but no one can. Right. And then I saw him on the Different Kind of Truth tour, and I used to have these like little, this is the way my mind works, but I used to have like these little imaginary like kind of like premises. I'm like, what if like Eddie really gets pissed off, right? And in between songs starts like whipping out a riff to like a song with Sammy Hagar, right? I mean, can you imagine like Dave just firing a look going, that's fucking pound cake. I don't sing that shit. You know what I mean? It's like, and the whole crowd going, what the fuck? I mean, but none of that happened. I mean, the only tour dates they canceled was because Eddie had like diverticulitis or something, I mean, and they had to cancel part of a tour, but they I don't think they actually recorded that album together. Dave did all his vocals in Jim Henson Studios.
Yes.
Separately, but they pieced it all together. They had to be in the same room some of the time together. I mean, and Eddie doesn't relinquish the production reins really when he's fully heavily involved in it. I mean, basically after what we saw in 96, I can't believe that I can't believe that they ever reformed 10 years later or 11 years later. I mean, because 96 was that was the VMAs, that whole thing was just an absolute public relations nightmare, a disaster. And I hate to say it, but Dave didn't come out looking so good about it either. I mean, it was, he was like almost too hammy on the VMAs. It's like, this is my time in the spotlight. I'm back. I got to take it. Even if it was only a minute and you're introducing a Beck video or whatever.
Well, back then, MTV was more proud of its roots and retrospectives and countdowns. And the first VMAs or the second VMAs, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is when Dave got all the VMA nods, and I think he lost all of them for California Girls.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think that's yeah. So, like was a pull to Susan Lucci or something, right? I mean, come on.
Yes, and then he had the quote like my dad told me, it's not whether you win or you lose, son, it's how good you look. That kind of David Lee Roth that we love. So my point to that whole thing is MTV used to do all these retrospectives every time the VMAs were coming up. Things of that nature, anytime you're talking about the history of MTV, and they always had Dave at the beginning of that because he was such a focal point of the VMAs. So MTV in 96, they weren't forgetting about Dave. They were still doing vintage programming, like not just say 120 minutes, which would throw back to stuff, maybe not Van Halen as much, but they had that show, what was it called? 12 Angry Viewers. Maybe that wasn't that. Man, why can't I think of a good example? But that's only like 2 years after the Jon Stewart show, which had Danzig, and I know it had Hagar and Van Halen on there. So MTV wasn't this like young person channel yet. It still embraced classic rock to some extent.
That's true. I mean, yeah, they were. I mean, at that point, '96, they really they were still less than 20 years old, right? I mean, and the fact that they did have Van Halen on, and then and around that same time also, when was it? Was it 95 or 97? They had Kiss come out in full makeup, which basically showed that everybody that they were, they did these big stunts with classic rockers because they still could gather somewhat that sort of an audience, or at least would reach them with the award shows.
Oh yeah, I believe that was 96 VMAs that the closer was them under the Brooklyn Bridge doing Rock and Roll All Night. And over the years, the VMAs had some interesting things like, was it Axl Rose with Don Henley? No, Axl Rose did Free Fallin' with Tom Petty somehow. And there was some weird Don Henley with Guns N' Roses thing. Am I making that up?
I can't remember. But I thought on one of the VMAs it was a big deal that didn't Axl do something with Elton John, which was everybody was like, oh my God, look at that, because a few years before that, didn't Axl wear a shirt that said something very derogatory about gays? I
think you're confusing Sebastian Bach with the infamous shirt that sandbagged his career, and I think you're doing Eminem and Elton John, but that Axl did the Freddie Mercury concert with Elton John. Man, whatever it is, MTV wasn't always garbage.
Right. That's the bottom line, what we're getting at here before we go completely off the rails.
And I remember in like 2001 or something like that. I think it was 2001. They had some big MTV party where Sum 41 was performing. They were the big like punk band at the moment that also had metal appreciation. And they brought out Rob Halford to do part of a song, and they brought out Tommy Lee to do part of the song. So there was your multi-generation classic rock passing the torch kind of thing. So in 96, Dave getting on the VMAs and all that, it's not like that was the only time he was ever going to be on MTV again. They were still playing Van Halen stuff in rotation. Plus VH1 all the time was playing Right Now, even though by that point, like that song was what, 4 years old, 5 years old.
Yeah.
That Twister song, you call it Humans Being, I call it the song from Twister.
Yes, we should mention that because that's where that was also part of that soundtrack, right? And that's what it was originally written for, correct?
Right. And plus Eddie and Alex had a weird instrumental song called something like Catch the Wind on Twister.
Right.
But the key is, like, Van Halen, they were not old men at this point, but Dave came on with the high-waisted pants and...
Yeah, and certainly a different haircut. Yeah, the whole thing just, when your heroes make you feel a little uncomfortable, and there's that cringeworthy, and as much as you might be a homer, you just go, oh man, this could have been gone so much differently,
Yeah, but if you look at what that era gave us, you go, okay, well, it gave us 3 new songs, one of them which is an undeniable hit and gem, one that we've grown to like, in my opinion, that's Me Wise Magic, and one that's better than no Van Halen at all.
Correct.
You can take me to the mat on that one. But okay, we got 3 songs, and then it led to Dave writing a really awesome book, one of the best memoirs I think you'll ever read from a rock star, and it led to I can't find any silver lining in the Van Halen end, but it led to Sammy Hagar doing some cool stuff, and it led to the DLR Band album, which is pretty good. So it's kind of like some temporary misfortune. I think some interesting art.
It's true. I was thinking, because I look at kind of the 90s, the mid 90s, 94 on, kind of like the lost, or at least for 4 years of it, kind of the lost David Lee Roth period, right? And he even said in his book at some point that, by the 90s, he was kind of like losing his passion for music a little bit after A Little Ain't Enough and that album. And And Jason Becker has, he was totally thought Jason Becker was an amazing guitar player and just, could barely finish the record, had all, ended up having Lou Gehrig's and all that. Your Filthy Little Mouth lays a big egg. The Vegas thing doesn't happen. Somewhere in the middle there, he takes over for Howard Stern, which we'll talk about as well some other episode. That kind of goes away. This thing, I mean, I'm sure Dave would maybe possibly tell you, yeah, probably not the best decade for me, but here's the thing that I kind of love. He took chances. He did things differently. I like Your Filthy Little Mouth. We'll do an album focus on that one. And I particularly love the DLR Band album, which I think is just bad. Not the best production and mix aside. I absolutely love that album. So, and somewhere in there, it wasn't around this time, he ended up saying, I'm ditching it all. I'm going to be a paramedic in New York City. I mean, come on. He's not sitting around in some mansion getting drunk, getting fat, and woe is me, resting on his laurels, playing, you know what I mean? I mean, he was still taking chances. He was still Dave. He was still going to the Himalayas, still doing crazy shit because he wanted to, because he had his own personal engine bringing him the passion and the motivation.
Yeah. Really weird comparison to make here. But were you a big Chris Farley fan?
Yes, I was.
Okay. I'm a huge Chris Farley fan. Anytime there's like an a retrospective or a bunch of new interviews or unseen footage, I clamor to watch it. Because the man was so much better than we realized. And one of the things that came out when Chris Farley died was he was visiting every free moment he could, like homeless shelters and children's hospitals and volunteering at soup kitchens. And it's kind of like, I guess he didn't sleep much. He was doing all these movies where he's making lots of money the last 5 years of his life, but he was just always doing something. With Dave, we know he speaks multiple language and he noodles a bit on a few instruments, and he's been using this quarantine to do all sorts of illustrations and art. Have you seen any of those?
I have. And wow. What kind of bums me out about this time was before Vegas, he just totally, stopped once again his podcast, which I enjoyed watching. This would be a great time for me doing the podcast. So Dave, get back on the podcast, man. There's all this free time. But yeah, the guy's, he's a Renaissance man. I mean, those illustrations are really, really good. They're really cool.
I just get the hunch that he does so much stuff that he just goes, I did it. And then he puts it in a filing cabinet or throws it out or like just gives it to his neighbor.
Yeah.
Because he's got this tattoo ink company, skincare company that's huge and employs like dozens of people. And allegedly, he said this, I don't know if this is true, that he took all the money that he made from the Van Halen reunion tours and put it into relaunching this.
Yeah,
I can't tell you if that's true, but yeah. How does he have these dozens of employees and we haven't heard one peep about anything?
Right. That's the strangest thing. I mean, on that respect, what was that company's name? Ink or something like that? Skincare for tattoos. I mean, that there was about 6 months worth of press and it's everywhere. And now it's not even mentioned. It's like, it's just, yeah, he's a mystery. I mean, it's just, it's constantly a mystery, constantly gets you wondering, constantly gets you thinking. And hey, one of the things I love about him, one of the things why we're doing this podcast.
And he claimed in some of the press for all the tattoo ink skincare stuff he was doing. I remember he talked about on Joe. Actually, I shouldn't say I remember. Either Joe Rogan or Mark Maron. He said that he had an offer from a magazine to write kind of musings in a column. And we have to assume that's Rolling Stone or Enemy or something like that. And he didn't. And you think how many rock stars in his position would have done that just to keep their names out there and keep themselves attached? He didn't do it. So.
Yeah. And he was doing a version of that. In fact, I found these are still up there, but somewhere within davidleeroth.com, which is not always the most active website. In fact, a few years back, he actually lost a domain and it disappeared for a while. But there are a whole bunch of blog posts from I think around like 2016 or 15 or somewhere around there. So they're like full length art. I mean, they're just one's about a stalker that he had, and another one's about was it playing football as a kid or something like. I mean, just it's just the stream of consciousness writing. I mean, I would have guessed he could have probably turned out a magazine column. He could have done a freaking year's worth in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, so I put all this out there, and we think about the narrative we just spoke about, that he spent allegedly 2 months, 6 weeks to 8 weeks, something like that, making these 2 Van Halen songs. That must have been torture for him to be just going over and over and over again, these little things. But his 90s output isn't very big. What, an album in 91, 94, these 2 songs, and DLR band in 98.
Yeah. I mean, the DLR band, that's his last full-length studio record of original music. So.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I won't call Diamond Dave a studio album because it was covers.
Yeah, we'll dig into that on an album focus episode. But, getting back to what you said, I mean, it was not, from what I've read in the book and what I've read about it as well, I mean, the 2 months he spent recording these songs, it was not the best experience. I mean, no doubt. I mean, Eddie doesn't tell the rest of the guys. He talks about his book, and I've read another place that Alex was blowing up at him because he's bringing in palm trees. I mean, in his book, he talks about how they separated him to record in like this little bunker, his vocals, with the rest of the band somewhere else. So he brings in potted plants and all this other stuff to make it, Shay Dave. And Alex is like, this is business. What are we doing? Freaking out about it. Me Wise Magic, the lyrics are like, Glenn Ballard writes a whole bunch of lyrics. Dave's got to, reshape them all to kind of fit him, for goodness sakes. So I'm sure this whole thing must have just been like, the fact that this whole thing could not have been easy, right?
I can't imagine anyone it could have been easy for. It definitely was not easy for the record company, because they didn't get a music video ultimately for either of the Dave tracks.
Good catch. Yeah, because there was supposed to be one for Me Wise Magic, actually, and it never happened.
Good luck trimming a 6-minute plus song down to a 3 to 4 minute video with guys that were already 40 something. Like, okay, well, how many models can we stick in there with blurred stage performance? Okay, maybe it can work per se. But the record company must be scared, going, oh man, we have to deliver this for the fourth quarter,
right?
To get this amount of profitability. We don't have the songs yet. We don't know what they sound like. We don't know if we're going to be able to work them at radio. Can Dave still sing? Are we going to get a tour? No, we're not going to get a tour. Okay, so we don't have a video or a tour or a band that does a lot of press, and we don't know what it sounds like. Okay.
Yeah. And, getting back to, and again, you take this, because you don't always know the full story. And I remember this was in Dave's book around all this time too. Sometime around there between the, lead up to the VMAs, I can't remember exactly, or certainly after they recorded these songs. The VMAs were in September. In October, this Greatest Hits came out. Right away, right after the VMAs, they're like, yeah, this isn't happening. And they later announced Gary Sharon's the lead singer. Well, in the midst of this, from what I read in the book, is that, Dave's saying, Eddie's saying, hey, let's take this one day at a time. We're not talking to any of the singers. Meanwhile, it breaks in the press that, yeah, they're looking for a new singer. So, I mean, I think no matter what, with just, again, it's amazing they ever did get back together in 2007 and then did the album in 2012, and that they toured. But because, my goodness, this was like the Palestinians and the Israelis with these two guys.
Yeah, we know who's steering the ship, and that is without a doubt the Van Halen brothers. But I have a feeling that Alex is actually the one steering the ship in the band, and we don't know it. There's some bands where the oldest member was the one who called all the shots. Like, I've heard in AC/DC that Malcolm Young was calling all the shots. Have you heard that?
Yep, I have, in different places. Yeah, I mean, he was the oldest one and started the band, right? I mean, because when he started, Angus was just a little school kid.
Yeah, yet Malcolm didn't sing the songs. I don't believe he wrote the majority of the songs. You look at the publishing, and Brian Johnson at a certain point really, really took over. I don't think a lot of people realize that he was on everything. And everything was, I guess, Johnson Young or Johnson Young. But
Yeah, he was up. Brian Johnson's on a bunch of them, but the last 2 records, I think he doesn't have any credit for the lyrics or anything. It's all Angus and Malcolm for the last 2 studio records. I'm not sure about the Razor's Edge,
really?
or Ball Breaker, one of those. But the last 2, what was it? I can't remember the name. Black Ice, and the follow-up. And the follow-up, when that came out, Malcolm had just died, right? And so, and I the thing I always heard about the follow-up album, what was it? Play Ball? It had I can't remember what it was, and I can't see it right here in front of me. But I heard that one was, that was put together from a lot of previous songs that weren't finished that Malcolm had, because I think when they were because their cousin Stevie Young is playing rhythm guitar on that. So by the time they went into the studio, I mean, Malcolm was suffering from Alzheimer's. So
yeah, but there's so many bands where a person in the band who is not the focal point or the primary songwriter or anything like that is actually the one calling the shots. And it's pretty surprising when you realize that kind of stuff. I think in Foghat, somehow it was always the drummer was calling all the shots.
Right.
And yeah, I just get the hunch that it's Alex as the big brother who's calling the shots.
And I think those shots were difficult to call because at the 90s, from what we know, at least through the 90s, early 2000s, I mean, Eddie had a lot of substance abuse issues, drinking, and Alex certainly did too. So, I mean, I think those 2 guys were not playing their A game for a good portion of and I remember reading part of Sammy's book. I know Sammy talks about some of those drug issues as well. I mean, and at one point, if you remember, like around that 2004 reunion tour, it was a marked difference between the Eddie that you saw in the early 2000s and what the Eddie you saw when they reformed with Dave in 2007, because Eddie looked like he was doing crank every day. Just, I mean, he looked like a hobo, for God's sakes. I mean, he looked horrible. I mean, it was scary.
Have you heard the Eddie Van Halen Fred Durst story that recently came out?
Yes. Oh my God.
Well, yeah. my friend Joe told me, I never read this, that this was the thing in Sammy's book that I don't remember, that whenever Ed's hair was up in a samurai style, look out and stay away from it.
Yes, I've heard. I think that is in Sammy's book, and I heard that too. And in fact, that's what I'm thinking. There was some pictures of Eddie where he's wearing what could only be described as some like baggy hobo culottes, some ratty Converses, no shirt, bone thin, a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and that freaking samurai man bun at the top of his head, and he looked completely wasted. So I mean, I bet that was the warning sign for Sammy, So
yeah. So if you ask me, was Dave lost in this period? Well, of course he was lost in the mid-90s, and of course his output wasn't the greatest output, but I still think that he was doing interesting things that we're never going to hear about.
I agree. I would have we did hear about him being a paramedic, right? Was that the late 90s after this and everything, and he disappeared? This is a guy who kayaked around New York City. I mean, I would, he must have been a good paramedic because he did it for a very long time, and it never came out from anybody that, he certainly didn't get fired. Never came out from, any other paramedics or anybody. It certainly would have been New York, and the Daily News of the Post was like, oh my God, man, if we hear one more story about the hookers that he, the groupies that he banged, and he was a shitty paramedic, that never came out. No. He was really good at that. I would love to find out more about that era. I would love to find out more about the things he did outside of the music stuff, because he always struck me as a guy when he, we wanted to do something, he did it, and he did it to there was nothing half-assed. Even if you think your filthy little mouth was half-assed, your heart's in the right place when you call up Nile Rodgers and say, yeah, I want you to produce this record.
Yeah, and wasn't Nile on Crazy from the Heat? Do I have that mistaken?
I'm not sure, but I know there was some heavy session folks on Crazy from the Heat.
I know Edgar Winter was on there.
Yep. And Edgar Winter was later, I think, in the Mambo Slammers.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yes, he was. And I was actually thinking of you yesterday. We were, the wife and I, while we were working, were listening to just records, vinyl records, and you put on a Beach Boys record, and after 12 minutes, you realize, oh, that's the side. Now I got to get up and change it because every Beach Boys song was 2 minutes. So I put on the Eat 'em and Smile record. And by the way, have you seen that on vinyl lately? Have you looked at that vinyl?
Not lately, no. I still have my original copy I bought in 1986 when I ran out to the record stop in my town in Riverhead, New York at that time. So,
well, that album has something I've never seen before, which is on the A side of the record, it's just his face, no track listing, and the B side is the whole listing, and it's his other side.
I don't remember. Wow.
He put a joke on the record itself. But I was looking at the credits, and kind of a correction to an earlier episode, it wasn't Brett Tuggle who played keyboards on that. There was all sorts of different keyboard players on that album.
Yeah, it was Jesse Harms, I think, or somebody.
Yeah.
There's a few folks on there. Yep.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot of keyboard players we're chasing down for this podcast.
Probably, man. Probably. So, well, on that note, I think we pretty much took a deep dive into this period of time with these songs. I'm going to go back and listen to Me Wise Magic one more time. Because I really did. That song ended up in this week's personal power rotation. Go figure.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I warmed up to it over time, and it's not one of my favorite Van Halen songs, but I'll take it over just about any classic rock band's output in the late 90s.
Yeah. I mean, it's that's the whole thing. That's why I was excited, because I always wanted to know what these guys were going to do next. They just didn't do very much next stuff for 20 years. So, and still aren't really doing anything. And at this point, maybe, hey, listen, you're 60 something years old. You want to retire. You got health problems. God bless. Take a load off. So.
Yeah. Couldn't said it any better than myself there, Steve. Well done.
Well, on that note, before we get out of here, where can folks find you, Darren? Because you always got stuff happening.
Thank you. The Paltrocast with Darren Paltrowitz every other Wednesday through iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, v13.net, anywhere you look for your podcasts.
Awesome. All right. Well, you can find the podcast and other stuff happening as we grow the DLRcast.com website. And as always, thanks for downloading and streaming. And Darren, we will be talking soon.
Looking forward. Talk to you next week.
All right. Take care.